Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we are going to be reviewing the film A Real Pain. Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for A Real Pain?
Sure. Mismatched cousins reunite for a tour through Poland to honor their beloved grandmother, but their old tensions resurface against the backdrop of their family history.
All right. So in Movies and Us tradition, we're going to start off with our one-sentence summaries. What is your one-sentence summary for A Real Pain?
My summary is, never underestimate the value of simply showing up.
Yes. So good. So good. A big theme in this film for sure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, my one-sentence summary is, feelings are hard, but also dope.
Yes, they are. So we've learned.
Yep. All right. Well, let's dive into our high-level thoughts about A Real Pain before we give away any spoilers of this film. So, Sarah, I'm curious to hear how you received A Real Pain. Did this film work for you?
Yeah, this film worked for me. I had such a good time hanging out with these characters and just going on this adventure with them. I'm really impressed the more that I've reflected on this film by how efficient it is. I love a 90-minute movie. So good. Not every movie needs to be 90 minutes, but man, when you get a 90-minute movie that does everything that this film does, I'm just blown away by it, because you have really interesting stuff going on with these two characters and kind of like a buddy comedy at times bit from them, but then there's also this like deep emotional stuff that's dope, as you said. And then there's also all of these other things to think about history and our family and what it looks like to remember those who have come before us. And there's just a lot packed into this film. And so just the more that I've thought about it, just the more impressed I have been from this film. And obviously a great performance from Kieran Culkin, who is so charming and wonderful in this. So yeah, all around, had a great time.
Love it. Yeah. This is a movie that we've been both excited to get to watch. And based on just like who wrote the film, who's cast in this film, and kind of what I've heard about it, I was hoping that this would be what I expected it was. And I'm so pleased that it was exactly what I thought it was going to be and more. Man, this movie really, really worked for me. I absolutely ate it up. I thought it was such a beautiful blend of these really big, meaty concepts that are packaged up in a way that is a little bit lighter and accessible and funny and earnest. There's so much that the character dynamics, I think, that were pretty nuanced, played out really well, and giving time for both characters to be equally as frustrating as they are charming and endearing. And then there's a whole host of themes, like you mentioned, that are packed into here around tourism and experiencing other cultures, reflecting on our past and our stories, facing our painful thoughts and feelings, and like everything in between is all woven into here. So there's so much to think about, and I like that the film invites us into some of these topics, but doesn't necessarily give us all the answers. It's just kind of like a come and ponder this, and if you don't, you can also just hang out with these two dudes. So man, I just was grinning ear to ear watching this movie and so pleased at how well this is executed. I think this is a movie that's also like understated in a lot of ways. I could see some people feeling like this was just like a wisp of a film. And I think that is a much more oversimplified viewing of this movie. There's so much in here if you're willing to take the time to really soak in it. There's a lot that's packed into here.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't feel overstuffed. You know, I feel like sometimes you watch a movie and you're like, oh, there's too much here. You were too ambitious. But that's not A Real Pain. There's so many layers to this film, and there's so many layers to these characters, but it doesn't feel out of place. It doesn't feel overwhelming. everything works together really well, and there's a good balance between the humorous, fun aspects and the deeper, weightier moments. And I feel like this is one of those films where all of those pieces are in perfect balance with one another, and they really complement each other to keep you watching and engaged for the entire 90-minute runtime.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things that I was so pleased by and impressed by this film, which might also be the thing that doesn't make it work for other people, which is how much the film doesn't lean into melodrama. There's so many moments that could be really big and emotional and dramatic and played up to be a big weighty moment, both on like these positive like moments of connection, but also these moments of pain throughout this film. And the movie doesn't lean too heavily into that. It's actually incredibly restrained. And just when you think you're going to get that big movie moment, it chooses not to give you the big flashy emotion, but all of the depth of the emotion is suggested. And I thought that this film consistently subverted our typical movie-going expectations time and time again, especially in a movie like this where you expect a big, like, heartwarming ending and it just doesn't give it to you. And I love how restrained this film is. People that listen to the pod know that one of my pet peeves is melodramatic manipulation, and this film literally does the exact opposite of it while still being incredibly emotional. And so the amount of restraint in this film, I just absolutely adored.
Yeah, because there's certain points where you expect. There's one scene in particular, which I will not spoil, but there was one scene in particular that I was watching and I was like, oh no.
Yeah.
This is gonna end in a total confrontation. This is gonna be so dramatic. I'm pre-stressed. And the film goes a very different direction. And I love that there is conflict and resolve all throughout this. You know, it's not muted in the emotions or the character interactions, but it's not melodramatic. Like you said, it feels much more true to life in a lot of ways of, you know, we'll have a disagreement and then it's like, okay, we got to keep going because we love each other, because we're family, whatever. And it feels much more natural, and it feels like these are real people that are doing this rather than these larger than life characters. And I think that's that humanization of these characters and them feeling so real and it being so easy to empathize with them helps make this a film that you want to spend time with them and you want to see what's going to happen next with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you actually bring up a really great point around the pacing of scenes and the way that the film begins to build a scene and then ends the scene much quicker than you expect it to. And there's these moments of conflict, like you mentioned, that you're gearing up for like the big blowout fight and it doesn't happen. And the next scene, like they're like, yeah, well, we disagreed on that. Or we opened up this like big moment from our past and we're, you know, life is happening. We're going on our next tour. We're going to see the next site. And so there's no time also to like have those big blowout emotional moments. And it's a lot more reflective, like you mentioned, of our actual human dynamics in reality, which is that relationships are messy and they aren't as clean cut as big, heavy emotional moment, conflict that we have all of the time in the world to sort out, and then full healing and restoration and reconciliation of the relationship. In reality, a lot of times it's these moments of disagreement, these buildups, these conversations where we open up maybe some of our wounds from the past, but you know, life is happening and we don't always have the time to clean it all up perfectly and reconcile fully. And that is, and you feel, I think, the history of how many moments that these two have had that are like that too, that contribute to the complex nature and dynamic of their affections, but also some of their frustrations with each other as well. And so I love how much this film showcases the messiness of human relationships and why we feel sometimes these complicated dynamics with some of the people that we love most.
And you see so many different sides of both Benji and David.
Yeah.
And I love that the film does that, because I really thought that the film would focus more on one than the other. And throughout you see there's kind of like an ebb and flow of who we're focusing on throughout. And I thought that that was so brilliant to give them both opportunity for these characters to like breathe and for us to see who they are and see these additional sides to them. Sometimes they're alone, sometimes they're with the group, sometimes they're with each other, but each character is given that opportunity, and it's not just focus on exploring one, but it gives a decent amount of time to understanding both. And I loved that. I'm so pleasantly surprised again at how much they were able to fit into this film, because to explore both of these characters who are so complex and do all of the other things that we've already talked about is a lot. Mm-hmm. And they pulled it off beautifully.
Mm-hmm. I love how much this film also allows the characters to be frustrating and then endearing all in the same moment.
Yes.
Sometimes like back to back, in from line to line, and they're, like you mentioned, constantly ebbing and flowing. So sometimes they're both very endearing together. Sometimes one is being really frustrating and the other one is very endearing and thoughtful. And then it flips. And then they're both sometimes really difficult. And I love how quick that happens. Again, like you mentioned, so true to life, so human, that all of the best and frustrating parts of ourselves are often like all existing at the same time and being expressed outwardly at the same time. And how quick that happens throughout this film is really fun to see. And I think constantly is asking us as the viewer too, how we feel about them. Because one moment I'm like, oh my gosh, Benji is so wise and so clear-minded in how he's viewing the world and really guiding and helping the rest of his group also realize parts of themselves and kind of breaking out of the numbness that modern society has all like lulled us into. And other times he's just being a little shit, and it's great how fast that can all happen within the same scene and sometimes moment to moment. So I loved how much this film leans into that very quick ebb and flow that's constantly happening.
I loved the moment early on. They're on this tour and Benji and David are talking, and then Benji says about Marcia, she's got this deep sadness behind her eyes, and is like, man, I need to go check on her, see how she's doing. And he runs up alongside her, and to start a conversation he insults her. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, yep, what? That's our strategy. She has this deep sadness behind her eyes. I'm going to go insult her to start conversation. It's so funny. And it's, to your point, this like really deep and profound piece of Benji and the way that he's able to read people and connect with people. And then he also just is constantly putting his foot in his mouth. And I loved it. You see this really, really sensitive side of him and this abrasive side of him in the span of like 15 seconds. It's so good.
Oh, it's so great. Yeah, that's I think one thing that we also should mention is that this film is so funny. I found it hilarious. And what's great is that it's sometimes like a very specific joke that's set up and teed up, but sometimes it's just the like situation that they're in. Just like seeing David try and stop all of Benji's colorful sides come out, and he's just like, all right, there he goes, and just some of the facial expressions, all of the like relational dynamics that make for some really funny moments in this movie. So good.
Mm-hmm. And we've seen Kieran Culkin play characters like Benji before. Hello, Succession. Yep. If you want more thoughts of ours about Succession, go listen to the first season of TV and Us, where we reviewed Succession season 4. But we've seen, thank you. We've seen Kieran Culkin do this type of character before. Lovable, but also abrasive and brash and all of that. And then we've seen Jesse Eisenberg play this character before that is neurotic and a little like tightly wound and struggles to connect with other people. And I love that we get to see these characters interacting together, and you see their strengths and their weaknesses and how they can pull both the best and the worst out of each other. And so I think that character pairing is just absolutely brilliant. And then obviously the casting is spot on. These two have such good chemistry and rapport together as well that as we have said, makes it so fun to watch them together.
Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. There's some really great moments that we should dive into a little bit, but let's give a spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen A Real Pain, it is streaming on Hulu. So we recommend checking it out before listening to the rest of our conversation because we're diving right in to some of those plot points and more specific details about these characters in this story. So yeah, I think you bring up a really great point around obviously these two are foils of each other. And what's really interesting is that I think that they both lean heavily into the ways that they are wired and the way that when they come together, they sometimes push each other to be more of their most extreme versions. And as we see throughout the film, they begin to also rub off on each other in a really beautiful way too, and encourage each other to adopt and experience some of those other sides that maybe is not their strength, but is a strength of the other. So we get to see how much David has such a like thoughtfulness and respectfulness for his environments, and there's a stability that he really values. And so he's not one to take big risks or go out of his way to start conversations, but also that isolates him in this group dynamic as well. And so his ability to connect with people is a little bit more limited. And then on the flip side, we see how much Benji is so emotionally in tune and able to be expressive with how he feels, but also feels so much so deeply that it sometimes creates this like chaos in his orbit when he just is following a whim or experiencing a deep amount of pain and not really sure how to handle and process these deep emotions. And so they are such foils of each other because David is so emotionally suppressed in a lot of ways. And then Benji is so emotionally expressive to the point where these emotions overwhelm him. And by the end of the film, you see they're beginning to take steps to like walk out, like, what does this look like for us to like adopt and come to the middle a little bit more. But at the beginning of the film, and it makes for some really funny moments, they are pushing each other to be more extreme versions of themselves. And so I think that's a really fascinating dynamic about how these two are wired. And then when they collide with each other, how that brings out different sides of them.
And I also find it fascinating that they both look up to the other one and pity the other one too. So I think that also gets to some of the complexity of human relationships and the complexity of family relationships too, because there's some complicated emotions when it comes to family members. And so I loved that David he doesn't just feel bad about Benji, or he's not just like, oh, okay, I have to be here to help try and like take care of him or whatever. But David, in some ways, really looks up to Benji and is amazed at Benji's skills and those
like him.
Yes. And I love that. I think that that's such an important piece of this that helps make their relationship so interesting, is that they're able to see each other's strengths and sometimes they're annoying strengths, but they're able to see and recognize and see they have enough self-awareness at times to also understand their own weaknesses and deficiencies as well. So it's a lot more nuanced and interesting when they are together. Then I think there's another version of this that is much more poorly written, where the characters are just in their like stereotypical extremes, and that would be a very uninteresting film. But because there's so much complexity and they understand some of their own complexity, they understand their own strengths and weaknesses and kind of lean into those, this screenplay really is able to shine.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I think that the monologue that David gives at the dinner with the group about Benji is like the perfect summation of that complexity, where he's like, sometimes I hate him. Sometimes I want to be like him. Sometimes I look up to him. Sometimes he's getting on my every last nerve. But and so all of that is all woven together. And it's neat too, because we never hear Benji's side of that as well. You know, like it's not expressed in the same way, but I think that it is so implied, and throughout the film you feel and experience this tenderness that he feels towards David, but also this frustration as well. And so all of that I think is so well written. And I actually love, for example, that the film doesn't give us Benji's side of it, because we don't need that. It is so implied and so baked into the plot, but it's specifically meaningful that David is expressing it, because he isn't as expressive throughout the rest of the film leading up until that point. So this is a big moment for him. It's a big character moment for him to share that about Benji, but also perfectly summarizes the complexity of their relationship dynamics.
And that scene at the dinner, that was the scene that I was bracing myself for, like, melodrama. I was ready, because he's pouring his soul out, and he's saying all of these things about Benji with his back to the doorway. And I'm just like, what are you doing?
Yep.
Are these people, if Benji shows up, are they going to give you like a signal to stop talking? Like, what if Benji is there and he's listening and he can hear you saying all these things? Like, I was so ready for Benji to appear in the doorway and just absolutely like freak out confrontation. I was ready. I was so stressed. And then the film doesn't go that way. And I love that they didn't lean into the very obvious dramatic way of writing that scene, but they went this subversive way that is much more interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And just Benji's playing his little piano.
It was so sweet.
All of it, but you know, it doesn't need to show us the aftermath of what that looks like. And from what we know about the characters too, there might not have been an aftermath. You know what I mean? It's like there's a knowing, and we just keep moving forward. Like, what is there to address really? Like, what is the point? One of the moments that I really loved in this film, that is an example of the restraint. I love that all of our favorite moments are like the things that the film does that aren't the big splashy moments. That's really amazing to me. But I love when David invites Benji over for dinner and Benji chooses not to go. And I think that the really soft, sickly, sweet version of this ending that's heartwarming would have been Benji says yes, ending shot of them at the dinner table with David's family and the little kid, and everything's like, oh, there's such a mending of their relationship. And after this big trip back to Poland, they feel more connected to each other than ever, and the power of human love and relationship together, right? That we've seen that movie a million times before. And I love that Benji says no, and he chooses to stay at the airport. And I love that David doesn't push on it either. But even just that invitation, I think, is so meaningful already. And that ending shot of Benji sitting at the airport is so complicated. The expression on Kieran Culkin's face has so many layered meaning in that. But I think that the film's kind of thesis is it's not healing, and relational connection isn't that fast sometimes, but it's through these little tiny moments of baby steps forward, showing that you care, even if it's not the full consummation of it, is meaningful and does build towards that trust and connection. And it's often really slow and takes a lot of time and like incremental steps forward, but it matters and it builds towards something. And so I love that we don't get the really heartwarming, like sepia toned, the camera zooming out as they're sitting around the dinner table laughing. Like, we don't get that at all. It's actually the complete opposite. They're alone and not together, but you can feel the weight of what this trip has meant. And that is more than enough. And I love that ending. I thought that was such a subversion of what we would expect from this really tender, earnest, family drama type of film that's kind of a comedy. We don't get the typical ending. It's great. It's so good. He says no.
Yeah, and like you said, and David respects that he said no. And I think that that's such an important piece of this too, that he doesn't push him or like try and guilt him into coming. He's just like, oh, okay, that is the boundary. I'm going to respect the boundary. We're good. It makes me think of something that we talk about pretty often, is that movies do more than just entertain. One of my favorite quotes that has just like stayed with me all the way from college is that art both shapes and reflects culture, and movies are part of that. And I think a lot of times, we love the heartwarming stuff. It's great. We need that. We need to be encouraged and inspired. But I think we also need movies like this that paint a more realistic version of things, like when you have these complex and difficult relationships, sometimes growth looks like an invitation to dinner, and sometimes growth looks like saying no. And that's okay. And you can still be in relationship. You can still have that love and affection there. And that's great. And you can keep going on with your lives, and so I think this is really valuable in showing a more realistic version of relationships, because the movies that we watch and the TV that we watch help shape how we view our relationships in real life. And so movies like this that are more true to life, more grounded, I think are really valuable as we look at our own relationships and our own lives.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And you're right that it doesn't create these unrealistic pie in the sky expectations out of our relationship and how we make progress in our relationships either. Like, I think the progress for these two by the end was Benji expressed, man, I like, we don't hang out anymore. Like, we don't see each other. You don't come to New York. You don't come to Binghamton. And David choosing to invite him is essentially his gesture and his way of saying, like, I hear you. I want you to feel seen in this. And even if you say no, like, that little bit of effort, like, is more than enough. That little gesture of, like, you made this comment earlier. I see you. I hear you. And whether we actually hang out today doesn't really matter. What mattered is I heard that you said this and I'm putting in the effort to try. And that's it. That is meaningful enough, And sometimes we maybe expect for this like incredible, like, warm, fuzzy feeling at the end of our progress in our relationships after we go through something like a international trip together. And sometimes it doesn't happen that fast. And it's the baby step, this little gesture that David did. And then also David choosing to respect Benji and Benji feeling seen in that is progress for these two. And that is more than enough, really.
And I love how clearly Benji is able to communicate how he feels and like what his needs are. Like, his emotional awareness, like you said earlier, is just astounding to me. Like, I'm much more of a David in this scenario. So I am amazed at people who are just so emotionally intelligent and are able to articulate how they are feeling in real time, because it takes me so long to figure that out. And so I loved those little moments when David will say something and Benji will almost like correct him. So there was when they were talking about how they used to hang out all the time and they would stay up all night, and David would be like, yeah, and I would always like fall asleep, and they're kind of joking about it. But then Benji says, I didn't care that you fell asleep. I was just glad that you were there. And so I appreciate that all throughout this film, Benji is maybe helping David to correct history a little bit. And those places where David maybe feels insecure because he is not the life of the party, he wasn't able to keep up with Benji and having fun. And Benji is able to say, like, hey, that's not actually what was important. And so I wonder if that ending where David extends the dinner and Benji is able to say no is like a continuation of that learning of Benji being able to say, hey, like, appreciate it. That's just not what I need right now.
Yeah.
And that growing self-awareness, but also growing awareness of what the other needs as well.
Yeah, no, that's so good. That's so good. And the clarity with which Benji can speak so clearly to David about his condition. And it's almost like Benji can see David sometimes more clearly than David can see himself, which is, I think, true of all of us as people. Like, our closest people that know us deeply can oftentimes spot things that we are blind to. And so it's cool to see the way that he's able to do that for David's character. Like, from the very beginning of the movie, they're on the train and he says to him, like, man, you used to feel things, man. Like, what happened? You don't feel things anymore. And and that's shocking. That's big. He's illuminating something for David that maybe no one else in his life is able to say so clearly to him, that will allow for him to have that emotional growth and be in tune with himself, and then therefore be able to pour out and like be with his family and show up in a way that is less suppressed than maybe he is right now. But sometimes we need those people that just like are straight shooters and tell it like it is and help us like identify those areas that we're truly just blind to.
And Benji is great at that. Whether you're ready for it or not. I loved that ending moment with Benji and James as well, because Benji confronts James about the tour, and it very clearly affects James in the moment, and he's having a hard time keeping it together in that moment. But in that parting conversation that we have, where James talks about he always asks for feedback and nobody has ever given it to him, and really taking Benji's words to heart, and Benji's truth-telling and Benji's honesty has reignited something in James too. And so he's going to potentially change how he does these tours and include these other aspects of it so it's not so touristy. And I think that this film is so smart in showing these pieces of Benji that they are his superpowers, and show his strengths and how he can help those around him make positive changes in their life that maybe other people wouldn't have the courage to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love that he doesn't do it perfectly too. You know what I mean? Like there's probably like a much more elegant way for him to have provided some of that feedback other than like yelling at James in the middle of this graveyard and like making a big show about it. But that's part of what makes him shocking and jarring and like exciting to be around too. I love that. Obviously, we talked about how Benji is able to see parts of David, Jesse Eisenberg's character, and call them out and help him grow in that way. But it's neat to see the way that David also is able to articulate to Benji the parts of him that are really magical. Like when they have that rooftop scene with the red lighting, the moody red lighting, and David is telling Benji about the ways that he just lights up a room. I mean, I think he says specifically you light up a room and then shit on everything inside of it, which is really funny and so accurate, but also part of Benji's charm. But I think there's an awareness that David also has that Benji might have a more negatively skewed view of himself, and in his state of experiencing so much pain and a lot of big hard emotions, he might have lost sight of some of those giftings that he has as well. And so he's able to encourage him and call out and tell him about the way that he captivates people and connects with people and is charming and lights up a room. And so it's neat to see the way that David also is able to see parts of Benji that he himself is blind to, and specifically the best parts of Benji that he really might have forgotten about.
Yeah, and that they have the rapport and the emotional trust to be able to say those things too. Like I love that conversation doesn't come right away, but that's one of their last conversations in Poland is because they haven't spent a lot of time together recently. And so it took them probably a little while to get like reacclimated and reacquainted with one another, especially given how this trip started. You know, you see David leaving him 1 million voicemails that he's not listening to, and then Benji's greeting is giving him a pocket yogurt. And so it takes a little while for them to kind of get on the same page with one another again. And so I love that that's not early on, but it's after we have been on this journey with these two and we've seen them both just at each other's throats and also just having a great time with each other. So you see the full spectrum of emotions before we get to that really just lovely and heartfelt moment that is also, as you mentioned, very hilarious.
It's so good because it's far too much to have to say to someone you light up a room. Like that's really ooey gooey. So we gotta temper it with like, yeah, dude, you also shit on everything else, but like We are captivated by you. You need to know. It's so good. It's so good. But yeah, you're right that like it's the journey that they've gone on together that has built almost like re-warmed up what was already there, but you kind of like, especially when you haven't seen someone in a long time too, there's a little bit of that first like a little awkward phase until you kind of settle back into that feeling of comfort with each other. So yeah, that's so good. I love in the moment where they meet each other at the beginning, how different their choice of attire and bag choice is, and
Mm-hmm.
how telling it is for who these characters are. Like you mentioned earlier, this film is very efficient, and a lot of those little details about their costume design and some of the set design and props that they're chosen for those characters are so perfect for them, and also tell us so much about how these people live their lives, because we know nothing about them at this point. So we're collecting all of the little details that we can to get an understanding of who these people are. And I just love like David's tiny little duffel bag and his like very standard born, boring, plain, like gray backpack. And then you've got like Benji's big giant like knapsack that's faded and fraying. It's so representative of their countenances. It's so good.
Yeah, and I love watching them like interact with those things too. Like I I loved it when they first get to Poland and they're in their hotel room and Benji finds the closet and he's like, "Oh, a closet." And then he just throws his jacket on the floor and then shuts the closet door. So it's just so funny seeing how these two are just constantly, like you said, they are foils to one another and they're just operating so differently in the world, and we're just forcing them into the same space at the same time, and hilarious moments ensue.
Yeah, it's so good. The opening sequence of David with a series of anxious phone
Oh
calls,
my
I thought
gosh.
is so great. It's so great. And then you find out that Benji's just been chilling at the airport, just like chatting with people with his like warm yogurt, waiting for David. So good.
And it's so funny because neither one seems to understand the other one. Like, David is like, "You've been here for hours? Like, what? This does not compute." And Benji, similarly, is like, "What are you doing? Like,
Yeah.
we don't have to do this. It's chill. We can just be at the airport." So it's just so funny that they're so different, and both of them in that interaction are like, "What is wrong with you?"
I think the word that David uses in his little like emotional dialogue at the dinner scene is like baffling. Like I just sometimes find him baffling, and
Yeah.
I think that's a very apt word choice. I too found Benji to be incredibly baffling. I like you mentioned, I think we're both way more Davids in
Yes.
our wiring, and but I'm like, man, when's Benji's next tour group trip? I want to go. I want to hang out with this dude. Like, just what is going to happen next? What is he going to say next? No idea.
Yeah, the moment when I was especially like, "Oh man, I'm David," was
Yeah.
when David was asking Benji, "What's the plan?" And I was like, "Oh no." That's me. I do that all the time. Somebody will like tell me something and I'm like, "Okay, great. What's the plan? Let's come up with a plan to get you there." Like it's so annoying. It's very funny. So when David was doing all of that, I was like, "Oh no." Is this what I do to other people? I'm so sorry. Oh, it's great.
It's so great. It's so great. Yeah. See, my "oh my gosh, I'm David" moment was literally the opening sequence of him just being like, "Where are you? Like, are you good? We got a flight to catch. Are you going to show up or not? Like, we're dealing with a loose cannon here, so I need to make sure that we're doing the dang thing."
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I was like, "Why are you're a millennial and you're using a phone to call someone? What are you doing?" I was so
Also,
confused.
to leave voicemails that are like,
Yes.
"Okay, no worries, ignore my previous one because like I'm not here now, but like where are you?" And then it's like 3 minutes later, Okay, ignore the I'm now standing here now, like, but like, where are you? What's your plan? When are you
Oh,
gonna be
it's
here?
so funny.
Yeah. Because you know that Benji probably is not very communicative. Like, David has no idea when this man's gonna show up and where they're gonna meet and how they're gonna find each other. Like, we probably haven't heard from Benji in like 2 months, but like 2 months ago he said he was coming on this trip. So I guess he's gonna be here. Not a clue.
Oh, it's so good.
But
And he's there, ready
stressing
at the
me out.
airport with a pocket yogurt,
Yeah.
ready
For
to go.
hours. You're like, oh,
For hours.
that was for nothing. But I empathize with the stress. It's great.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay. Other interesting things that I think this film does is the green and sepia toned like color tinting I thought was really notable, particularly when they're in Poland. I just think that like there's so much that obviously deals with some like big heavy topics and places that are significant in history, and especially for this tour group and especially for our two main characters. But it's tinted with this like warmth, and the green is vibrant, and I thought that was a really fascinating pairing with the subject matter, and sometimes even the conversations that our characters are having. Like, they're in this sepia tone bright green environment talking about like pain and suffering. And I thought that was a really great way for the film to ensure that there was a balance and a levity that's kind of woven into this. Like, we're going to cover some big heavy things, but this is not like Schindler's List, and we're not going to barrel it over your head, because there is a levity that's part of this as well. And I think it helps make the moments of humor also land well, because we're not too heavy and deep into something that's big and burdensome. And so I thought that was a really interesting way to visually cue us too of the tone of this film, and for us to not get too sucked into cognitively what is a lot of big heavy topics, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's something about this film that actually reminded me of Columbus. We just rewatched this not very long ago and discussed it on the podcast Soundtrack Your Life. So that should be out soonish.
Mm-hmm.
So go listen to that. But Columbus is so meditative and reflective, and there are some aspects of it. I think it's like the rich leafy greenness with these really stark modern buildings. That contrast we see throughout A Real Pain and in Columbus. And so I think for me that just helped put me into an even more like reflective state. A Real Pain is a very different film, but I think that there are some similar visual aspects that they share that I think really complement what's going on. And I loved those. There's a moment when they're walking around a city, and James is reading out what a building used to be, or like what used to be there, and you'll see just a shot of something that looks totally different. And I loved visual choices like that you don't spend a lot of time there, but I feel like it so efficiently captures these themes around reflection in our history and how do we interact with our history without it being too heavy. Like, it's the appropriate emotional depth, and I love how much of that theme is communicated just through what we're seeing visually on the screen.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. The comparison to Columbus is really interesting because they both are also learning to connect with themselves more deeply and through that with each other in this kind of like duo of our leading two characters. What's also interesting too, and I think I noticed it most when they are visiting the concentration camp, is how much it also is aligned to kind of Benji's thesis around we need to take the time to allow ourselves to empathize, you know? And so like there's this jarring feeling of like this bright sunny day and the blue skies, but you're also walking through places that horrible atrocities have happened. And so there's work and there's effort and there's engagement that is needed from us and our hearts to empathize and to imagine what life was like here. So it's notable that they didn't film that whole sequence when it's, I don't know, the fall and it's a gray, gloomy, overcast day. No, like they're there when it is lush and the sun is shining, the skies are blue, and yet Benji's inviting everybody throughout the film to do the work, to cross that divide between our current state and our modern comfortable states of numbness, to really put ourselves in those shoes and to do that heart work. And so I thought that was an interesting way to get us as the viewers to also like come along with him on that journey, and that it's not easily done, like it's not this gray, gloomy, overcast day where you can imagine the atrocities are here when they were cold and suffering. No, it's a sunny springtime day, and yet it takes time for us to be able to engage and cross that divide, to really put ourselves in the shoes of what actually happened here. And so that was a fascinating choice. And I think also like tonally it fits the film, but also like at a conceptual level also works with so much of what Benji is advocating for too.
That's a really good point. And I love that is continued even after the tour, once they get back to the hotel and James is kind of asking like, hey, how is everybody feeling? And we had just watched Benji openly sobbing on the van ride back. And then the others are like, oh, I'm numb, like I can't process this. And I love that that's included in there as well. And that reality of, we all cope with difficult things differently. And it echoes that theme that Benji had been, or maybe that, I don't remember where it comes in the story, but where Benji is telling David like, hey, you used to feel, you should feel. And we're seeing how all of these different people are dealing with their emotions in very different ways. And Benji is constantly the one advocating for expressing your emotions instead of bottling up and hiding them, even though that's the easier thing to do. I love that those through lines are just woven for the entire film. And it's not in stops and starts, but it's just who Benji is. And we just see that piece of him showing up in different ways in every scenario that he enters into, and is constantly trying to find ways to get people to express themselves when it's just easier not to, and probably more socially acceptable not to as well.
That's so good. And what's really cool is that we get to see the character of Eloge experience and grow from what Benji was saying. Like there's, Benji has this whole bit that he's sharing with the group on the train of like, are we not seeing what is happening here? Like, does anyone feel anything about this moment if we zoom out for a hot second when they're on the train in first class? And then a few scenes later, he comes up to Benji while Benji's walking with Marcia and says, so I was thinking about what you were saying the other day about suffering. And then Benji goes, dope, man. Nice. Yeah. And then we get to see the payoff of that, where after they have the visit to the concentration camp and James is asking how they all feel, Eloge says, I feel shaken up, but I think that's better than feeling nothing at all. And you're like, oh my gosh, the Benji effect is happening. And you see the way that he listened to what Benji said, chewed on it, processed it, and is now putting it into practice and expressing it so clearly with this group of people. And so you get to see this little mini arc for one of our side characters as a result of Benji just being Benji. And I thought that was like a really cool set of few little details that are kind of like littered throughout here around these characters really thinking deeply about these ideas and walking it out as well.
And I think it's fun that Benji creates space for other characters to join him while also being themselves. Because I feel like it's easy to like, oh, come do this thing with me or come be like me. Whereas Benji is just like, oh, this is a good thing. Apply it in your way. So like the silly example of this is when Benji wants to take a picture with the statues and he wants to be one of the soldiers in the fight. And Eloge wants to join him, but he is not going to be a soldier. So then he becomes a medic. Yeah. And then little by little, they all join, but they all join in different ways. So James is a plane, And I love that. Like, Benji wants to do a thing. He wants to create this space for fun or emotional expression or like all of these things, but he's not demanding that people do it his way, but he's really good at like creating the space and then letting other people come to that space as themselves. And I feel like that's such a special thing that some people like innately have that gift, and it's just cool to see that portrayed in a film like this.
It's so good. And you see the way that it's also contagious too. Like, because Benji is comfortable and expressive and excited about this, he is now inspiring the other people. Because at first they're kind of like, I don't really know. But one by one, they're like, okay, that looks fun, you know? And so the feeling of confidence that Benji has in the things that he's excited about, I think really does rub off on other people and inherently invites people in. It's cool too, because I was thinking about this after the movie ended, how much we obviously know the amount of pain and the depth of pain that Benji's experiencing, but we also get to see that when he experiences joy and silliness, it is also so full and abundant and contagious. And in a lot of ways, it's such a contrast to David, who, as I mentioned, is emotionally suppressed, but both emotions are suppressed in him too. So he might not be creating space for some of those hard negative emotions because they're really hard to deal with, but it also is suppressing his experience of the fullness of joy too. And so the emotional freedom that he has to feel all of the emotions are all affected by it. And I think that's such a contrast to Benji, who feels deeply for all of the colors of the emotions that are experienced, even the good ones too, because you see in that moment how much David is stunted. Like he's not experiencing the joy and the silliness. He's not allowing himself to. So I think that's another fascinating, like, uber point thesis aspect of seeing these two operate next to each other and juxtaposed together, is how much the suppression of emotion also impacts the best emotions too, and David's inability to experience them.
Jen, it's Inside Out all over again.
Yes.
Benji has his whole, like, whatever that emotional board is.
Control center.
All the buttons are available. All the colors are on. Whereas David's is all grayed out.
Yeah. Totally.
David.
Totally. Oh, it's so good. Who would have thought?
Wow.
A real pain. Put in conversation with Inside Out, man.
I mean, it works though.
Benji's control room. That must be a fascinating, colorful, chaotic space.
I'm here for that. Can we get a real pain Inside Out crossover? Because that would be so fun.
That would be really fun. Oh my gosh. Wow. Yeah. That's good. That's really good. I need to think about that one. That's fun. Okay, any other big things that we wanted to mention before we wrap?
Okay, I just have a bunch of little things.
Okay, I'm ready.
There's like 4 of them, maybe 5. I don't know. We'll see what we do. Okay, one of my questions is, did you notice? So this is about David's fashion choices. When he has a button-up shirt, he only buttons the top button, and then everything else is unbuttoned. And I cannot for the life of me understand why that is the choice.
Yeah. I did not notice that. I did notice that he would wear the classic, like, dorky, like, middle school boy outfit, which is like the plain tee with the plaid, flannel button up. But yeah, one button. Then just the other that's just flapping in the breeze on the bottom.
Yeah. I don't understand how that's comfy. I would be so bothered, especially because he seems like a very particular person. I don't know how we arrived at the one buttoned
but like is
conclusion.
This truly a character defining detail for him? Because
could be.
Like, I wouldn't put it past him. Be like him thinking this is a great idea.
It very well could be. So I had questions for David.
Manifesto around how this is actually superior than the way everybody else is doing it in his psychology.
Honestly, respect.
Of course. Yeah.
You live your life with your one button.
Yeah.
Please enjoy. Okay, second little thing is, did you notice that there is a pinky ring in this film?
No. Oh my gosh. Who could it be? There's no villains in this.
There are no villains in this.
No.
So, yeah, Benji wears a pinky ring all throughout, which is very interesting.
That does seem right for him.
Right? Like, it works for this character, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think I might have to adjust my pinky ring hypothesis a little bit more. Maybe we just need to exclude indie films from my hypothesis.
Or just like quirky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Characters that are like very clearly. Because it's his pinky ring choice is like not out of this desire for wealth and power and control, which usually it is for the pinky ring wearers of our data set. He probably got it from like some dude on the side of the street that he built a bond with, underneath the bridge that, is a memento. And like, there's a whole story of how he got this ring.
I'm certain.
Of some colorful character that he met somewhere. Yeah.
Well, and it is interesting because his, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, is just like a thin silver band. Like, there's not a lot of bling to it, where I feel like a lot of the villains who wear pinky rings are like, it's a big, bold thing. It is a wealth and status, a power symbol that you are wearing this gaudy thing on your pinky ring finger. Whereas Benji's, it's just very simple. It's easy to miss because it's so small, which I think is also just speaking to the fact of like, that's more of who this character is. There's a lot of vibrancy and colorfulness in him, but there's also a simplicity about him too. So anyway, it's just an interesting data point here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting data point. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Any other big things that we want to mention? Or anything else on your list?
Okay. 2 more silly little things. In the Polish taxi that they're driving in as they're leaving, there are 2 bobblehead dogs in the taxi. And I just thought that was so fascinating. I have so many questions about why there are these bobblehead dogs in this taxi. But I thought that was funny and interesting. So I wanted to point it out.
A little memento of, I don't know, dogs that have passed, I don't know. Or, I don't know, people love their pets,
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? Okay, what's your last thing?
My last thing is just shout out to Jennifer Grey, who plays Marcia. It was so nice to see her in something. She is very famous, obviously, from Dirty Dancing. Nobody Puts Baby in the Corner. She was that baby. And she was also in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So, like, I watched those movies so much when I was younger and just felt like I spent so much time with Jennifer Grey. And it was just wonderful to see her in this. She's not like a super prominent character, but it was just great to see Jennifer Grey out acting, doing stuff. I was so happy to see her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, she makes a big splash anytime she's on screen. She's not on the screen often, but when she does, it is pivotal. So, very good. Very good. All right. Well, this is our review and discussion about A Real Pain. You can find it available, as we mentioned, to stream on Hulu. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories, so everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune to your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review letting us know your thoughts about A Real Pain. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at moviesanduspod, or email us at moviesanduspod@gmail.com. We will be back soon to discuss the film The Apprentice. We are on our way to this year's Oscars, so we're going to be watching a bunch of Oscar-nominated films over the next couple of weeks. So join us on this journey as we get to experience all of these films, then get to talk about them in awards season. So we hope you have an amazing week, and we'll talk again with you all very soon.